A welcome to Revenge Oath Tonight, London's most powerful live in fear, as a single, unseen blackmailer pulls their strings from the shadows. Sealed letters, whispered threats, and ruined reputations lead Sherlock Holmes into a web where every secret has a price. Your comments are very important to me. Tell me where you're watching from today. Now let us follow Holmes as he hunts the unseen hand and exposes the blackmailer of London's elite. It was in the latter part of October, when London wears that peculiar countenance of sombre magnificence which belongs to no other city upon earth, that I found myself once more established in our old quarters at Baker Street. The year had been one of those in which the fog seems not merely an accident of weather but a deliberate spirit, creeping in at windows, clinging to the gas lamps, muffling the hoofbeats and wheel rumble of the streets and turning the familiar into something spectral and uncertain. Holmes, as I have elsewhere recorded, was never so wholly alive as when the world outside was made indistinct. The very obscurity that oppressed ordinary men appeared to kindle his brain, as though the shadow were an ally which concealed from lesser eyes the fine threads of truth that he alone could see and seize. I had returned from a professional engagement in the north, and it was with some relief, perhaps even with that unconscious yearning for stimulus which a man acquires by long companionship with genius, that I climbed again the 17 steps and heard Mrs. Hudson's familiar, reproachful murmur at my lateness. Holmes was stretched upon the sofa when I entered, his the nervous figure in that attitude of languid repose which deceives only the unacquainted. A pipe lay near his hand. A thin blue veil of smoke drifted up and dissolved among the books and chemical apparatus upon the shelves, while upon the table was scattered the detritus of his idle hours, an uncut volume of German philosophy, a magnifying lens, a violin bow, and a heap of letters, some opened, some still sealed, as if he had begun to read and then dismissed them in contempt. He turned his head as I came in, and his grey eyes rested upon me with that bright, questioning stare which seemed always to strip away pretense and to penetrate at once to fact. "Ah, Watson," said he, as calmly as though I had left him but an hour before, "you have been to Hexham." I confess that I stood rooted for an instant upon the threshold, my hand still upon the door. "Really, Holmes," I began. "Do not waste your astonishment," he returned, yawning. "It is a very simple conclusion. Your boots are splashed with the red clay of the Northumberland roads, not the chalky mud of Surrey. The cuff of your left sleeve bears a faint smear of printer's ink. The Hexham Courier is printed with an oilier black than the Newcastle papers. Your right glove has the powdery stain of antiseptic, which tells me you have been in a country surgery where carbolic is still employed with enthusiasm. You were away then, and the only place where those things unite, in my experience, is Hexham." "You amaze me as ever," said I, laughing, though as always there ran beneath my amusement a certain chill, as if I had been made suddenly conscious how transparent a creature one is to those cold, observant eyes. Holmes waved the compliment away with an impatient hand. "You look tired," he remarked. "There is a touch of yellow in the conjunctiva. You haven't slept well, and your mouth has that set which comes of responsibility. You have been consulted in a case which disturbed you." "It is true," said I. "A young woman—" Holmes raised his hand. "Pray spare me. I have no desire to be dragged into your professional tragedies. If you wish to share them, do so for your own sake. But do not imagine that my interest is engaged. My mind—" and here his expression changed, the indolence falling from him like a cloak. "My mind has been occupied with something else entirely." He sat up, and, taking one of the unopened letters from the table, tossed it to me. "Read that," said he. It bore a heavy cream paper, and a seal of dark green wax impressed with a crest, 3 fleurs-de-lis over a barred helmet. The address was in a firm, cultivated hand. I broke the seal and drew out a single sheet. The writing within was brief, and the words, even at first glance, had that quality which makes one's pulse quicken. A restrained urgency, a carefully marshalled fear. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street, London. Sir, I am in need of your discretion more than your talents, though I have been assured that you possess both in equal measure. I am threatened, no ruined, unless I can lay hands upon the one who holds certain papers against me. If you are willing to receive a client at an unorthodox hour, I shall come to you this evening at 10:15. I beg you, on no account, to communicate with the police. Yours in desperation, IRH. There was no date, nor any indication of the writer's residence. I looked up from the letter. Holmes had resumed his pipe, and his eyes, half closed, watched me through the curling smoke. R.H., said I. A person of position, surely. The paper, the crest, and the absence of a full name, Holmes cut in, which indicates that our correspondent is either sufficiently prominent to fear recognition or sufficiently accustomed to being obeyed that he presumes upon your imagination. Observe the wording, Watson. Threatened, no, ruined. That dash is not the dash of a man seeking drama, but of a man whose imagination runs ahead of his pen. He is frightened, and he is also proud. Discretion more than talents. A little bow to my reputation, but with a hint that the affair is one of society rather than of mere crime. And note the commanded on no account to communicate with the police. A blackmail case, I suggested. Holmes nodded. It has that flavour, said he, and yet it is not the flavour of the common garden. The blackmailer who preys upon the foolish young man and the faithless wife is a familiar nuisance. But this, he tapped the crest with his long forefinger, suggests a riper quarry. If R.H. is what I think he may be, the matter touches those circles where a whisper does more damage than a knife. You have an idea, then, of his identity? I have several, said Holmes, and his lips curved in that thin smile which always portended mischief. But I shall not spoil my own amusement by settling too soon. Let us say that our visitor is either Sir Reginald Havisham, who has lately been much spoken of in connection with a certain Italian singer, or the Right Honourable R.H., who sits in the cabinet and is reputed to have once written sentimental verses in a moment of youth, or, and here he leaned forward slightly, he's not the victim at all, but the agent of another sent to feel me out. You astonish me, I said. From so little... Holmes's eyes flashed. So little, he cried. Oh, Watson, you persist in that error. There is no such thing as so little. There are details, and there are minds too dull to see them. Now, his tone altered again to the quiet, practical one of the man of action. We shall have our visitor at 10:15. It is now a little after 9. You will do me the kindness to keep your revolver at hand, and perhaps to encourage Mrs. Hudson to retire early. There is something in the phrasing of this letter which suggests not merely shame, but danger. You think he may be followed? I think he may be forced, said Holmes. Blackmail is not always conducted with envelopes and stamps. There are men in London who use fists and knives as readily as paper. There are others who use neither, but who contrive to destroy with nothing more than a sentence whispered in the right ear. He rose and crossed to the window, drawing aside the curtain. The street below lay in a yellow blur of light and fog. A hansom passed, its lamps like two faint stars. A policeman's figure loomed and vanished. Somewhere a woman laughed, an odd, brittle sound that was swallowed at once by the damp air. Holmes stood for some moments motionless, his profile sharp against the paler square of the window. Then he spoke without turning. "Do you recall," said he, is the case of Lady Milverton. I started at the name, for the memory of that singular adventure, one of the few which had shaken even Holmes's iron composure, was vivid in my mind. Lady Milverton, the most dangerous woman in London, the incarnation of evil in a respectable dress, the spider at the centre of a web of secrets. How could I forget it? I replied. Holmes's shoulders rose and fell in a slight shrug. London breeds many Milvertons, said he. One is taken and another creeps into the same hole. The trade is too profitable and human vanity too dependable. But there is a difference, Watson. Milverton was a collector, an archivist of shame. She hoarded, she revelled. She used her power with the complacency of one who sits behind a locked door. He turned now, and there was, in his expression, something I could not at once read, a kind of hard brightness, as when steel catches light. This new creature, if creature it is, does not hoard. It strikes quickly and vanishes. It has frightened men who would have laughed at Milverton. It has chosen victims who cannot bear even the shadow of scandal, and it does not merely ask for money. What then? Holmes's smile returned, thin, unreadable. That, said he, is what our visitor will tell us, if he tells us anything at all. He moved to the mantelpiece, where the Persian slipper stuffed with tobacco rested, and filled his pipe with delicate precision. Then, with that little air of ceremony with which he always prepared for a new problem, he drew the armchair closer to the fire and indicated that I should take my accustomed place opposite him. Thus we sat, T. Holmes silent, his eyes fixed upon some inward vision, while I, with the letter upon my knee, watched the clock upon the mantel as its hands crept toward the appointed hour. Outside the fog thickened, the window panes became opaque with moisture. The noises of the street diminished until only the occasional rattle of a distant carriage or the muffled call of a newspaper boy penetrated our room. At 10:15 precisely, there came a sharp knock upon the door below. Holmes's hand darted as quick as a striking snake beneath the cushion of his chair and emerged with a small, well-worn pistol. He nodded to me, and I, understanding his glance, rose and took my own revolver from the drawer where I had placed it upon my return. There was no panic in Holmes, only that swift, alert readiness which was as natural to him as breathing. Mrs. And Hudson's footsteps sounded upon the stairs, slower than usual, as though she too sensed something amiss. She opened the sitting-room door. "A gentleman to see you, sir," she said, and in spite of her efforts at composure, her voice quivered. He would not give his name." "Show him in," said Holmes quietly. A moment later, the man entered. He was a tall figure, wrapped in a dark cloak with the collar turned up. A soft felt hat was pulled low over his brow. As he stepped into the light, I saw that his face was pale and finely cut, with the clean-shaven jaw and carefully trimmed moustache of a man accustomed to good society. Yet there was something in his eyes which did not belong to the drawing-room, an uneasy darting, among the look that went to the corners of the room and lingered upon the curtained window as if he expected to see a shadow pressed against the glass. He closed the door behind him with his own hand and stood for an instant as though listening. Holmes remained seated, his pistol now invisible once more, his attitude that of genial indifference. "Pray take a seat," said he. "This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson. You may speak freely before him." The man hesitated. His gaze flickered to me, and I observed that his hands, though gloved, were held stiffly, as if concealing some tremor. "I had hoped," he said at last, his voice low and controlled, "to speak with you alone, Mr. Holmes." Holmes's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "You may speak with me alone," said he, "if you insist. But you will find that doctor, or Watson, has the peculiar gift of being both discreet and useful. You have come here because you are in need. It is not the moment to stand upon etiquette." The man's nostrils flared, and for an instant pride struggled with fear. Then fear won. "Very well," he said. "What I am about to say must not leave this room." "It will not," said Holmes. The stranger seated himself upon the edge of the chair, as though ready to spring up at any instant. He removed his hat, revealing hair that was carefully brushed yet damp at the temples. A bead of perspiration shone upon his forehead, though the room was not warm. "My name," he began, and then stopped. His lips tightened. "You may call me Mr. Harrowby." Holmes's eyebrows rose a fraction. "As you please," said he. "Mr. Harrowby, you are being blackmailed." The man started as if struck. "Oh, how?" Holmes shrugged. "The letter you wrote," said he, "the hour you chose, the insistence upon the police. You might as well have come carrying a placard. The question is, what is the nature of the blackmail, and who is the blackmailer?" Mr. Harrowby's hands gripped the arms of the chair. "It is not," he began, and then his composure broke for the first time. "It is not money alone. God knows I would pay any sum. But this person, this fiend, has demanded something else, something that I cannot give without destroying others." Holmes leaned forward, the indifference gone. The air of the room changed as though some electrical current had been switched on. "Proceed," said he. Mr. Harrowby drew a deep breath. "For the past 6 months," he said, "certain men of rank, of influence, have received letters. They are not crude threats. They are polite, almost affectionate. They refer to matters known only to the recipient, private indiscretions, youthful follies, correspondence that was believed destroyed. With each letter comes proof, a copy of a note, a fragment of a photograph, a detail that cannot be guessed." He paused, his throat working. "The writer asks at first for a small concession, a favor, a signature upon a paper, an introduction, a vote in a particular direction. Nothing that seems in itself criminal, but always something that places the man who complies a little more firmly in the writer's power." Holmes's eyes were fixed upon him like a lens. "And when the victim refuses?" Holmes asked softly. Mr. Harrowby's face whitened. "Then the ruin begins," he whispered. A whisper in a club, an anonymous note to a wife. A packet delivered to a newspaper. One man has already... He shot himself last week in his rooms in St. James's. They said it was melancholy. It was not. It was terror. I could not restrain an exclamation. "Good God!" Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw the faint tightening at the corners of his mouth which told me the matter had indeed seized him. "You have received such a letter," said he. "Yes," Mr. Harrowby replied hoarsely. 3 days ago, and this morning I received the second." He thrust his hand into the inner pocket of his coat and produced an envelope. It was of the same heavy cream paper as the first, but unsealed, as though he had torn it open in haste. Within was a sheet of paper covered in neat, slanting handwriting. Holmes took it with a pair of forceps from the table, as if, in truth, it was something unclean, and held it to the light. His eyes ran over the lines with extraordinary rapidity. I watched him, and though I could not read the words from where I sat, I saw the effect upon my friend. A slight stiffening, a momentary narrowing of the eyelids, then that same thin smile. "You have done well to come," said Holmes. Mr. Harrowby leaned forward eagerly. "You will help me?" "I will do what can be done," Holmes answered, "which is not always what is desired. Tell me, Mr. Harrowby, this blackmailer of yours, have you ever seen him?" "No." "Have any of the victims seen him?" Not to my knowledge. The letters are delivered by post, but always from different districts. Sometimes from London, sometimes from the provinces. One came stamped from Dover, another from York, but always the handwriting is the same. Holmes nodded. And the demands, these favours, are they directed toward any one object? Any pattern? Political? Financial? Personal revenge? That is the worst of it, Mr. Harrowby cried. And now the controlled man gave way to despair. There seems no pattern, a vote upon a committee, the appointment of a clerk, the recommendation of a certain firm, a charitable donation, yet to a charity that does not exist. It is as if the blackmailer takes pleasure in proving that he can make men dance. Holmes's fingers tapped lightly upon the paper. There is always a pattern, said he, if one has eyes to see it. But we must begin with what we know. You have mentioned one suicide. Who was the man? Mr. Harrowby hesitated, then answered in a voice that was scarcely audible. Lord Fenwick. Holmes's head lifted. Fenwick of Brackenhurst, the one who sits in the Lords and has the reputation of a saint? The same, whispered Mr. Harrowby. He was found with a pistol beside him, a note. Forgive me, nothing more. His wife has taken to her bed. The newspapers were discreet, but those of us who received the letters, we knew. Holmes sat back. And you, Mr. Harrowby, what is your position? The man's lips tightened again. I have influence, he said, enough to be useful to him, enough to be ruined. Holmes's gaze grew very keen. You are not merely a gentleman with a secret, he observed. You are a gentleman with access. Mr. Harrowby's eyes flashed with anger. You have no right. Holmes raised his hand. My right, said he, is the right of the surgeon to probe if he would remove the tumour. If you conceal... And you perish. Now this letter. May I read it aloud? Mr. Harrowby swallowed. Yes, he said. Holmes's voice was calm, almost conversational, as he read, My dear sir, your silence has the charm of prudence, but prudence, like every other virtue, must be exercised in company. I am gratified to find that you value your friends as well as yourself. I am less gratified to find that you have not yet performed the small service I requested. You will, therefore, be good enough to deliver on Thursday next at 11 o'clock to the porter's box at Charing Cross Station a sealed packet addressed simply B. No name, no words. It will contain the enclosed. Should you fail, I shall be compelled, most unwillingly, to widen the circle of those acquainted with a certain matter of October 1888. You will forgive me if I remind you that the ink of youth is extraordinarily permanent. Your obedient servant, a friend. Holmes ceased, and the room seemed, for an instant, even more silent than before. The fire crackled softly. Somewhere below, Mrs. Hudson moved a chair, and the sound came faintly up the stair like a furtive footfall. Holmes held up a small object that had been enclosed with the letter. It was a strip of photograph, scarcely an inch in width, showing only a fragment, a man's hand, recognizable by a signet ring, the cuff of a sleeve, and beyond, a portion of a woman's bare shoulder. The very incompleteness of the image gave it a cruel suggestiveness. Mr. Harrowby's face had become ashen. You see, he whispered, he has the rest. He has more than that. Letters, notes, things I thought destroyed. He knows. He knows everything. Holmes studied the photograph fragment intently. This is excellent, said he. Not for you, perhaps, but for me. The paper is of a particular make. The edge is torn, not cut. The exposure is the work of an amateur. And the ring? He handed it to me. It was indeed a hand I could imagine belonging to a man of rank, long fingers, a well-shaped nail, and upon the little finger a signet engraved with a crest. I could not, of course, identify it, but the thing had an air of reality, of intimate menace, which made me understand how a man might be driven to desperation by such proof. Holmes returned to his chair and steepled his fingers. "Thursday next at 11, said he, Charing Cross, a packet addressed B and the enclosed, which is this fragment, I presume, or something more." There was also Mr. Harrowby's voice faltered. "There was also a small key." He produced it from his pocket, a plain brass key worn smooth by use. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "A key," said he. "To what?" "That is what I do not know," Mr. Harrowby replied. There was no explanation, only the key and the photograph. Holmes took it, weighed it in his hand, and held it up to the lamp. "Worn on the wards," he murmured. "Not a new key, used often perhaps by a man who carried it loose with others. The make is common. It may open 100 locks in London, unless the lock itself has been altered. Still, a key is a promise. It suggests a box, a drawer, a place where things are kept." He looked up sharply. "Mr. Harrowby, you have come to me because you are frightened. Good. Fear is honest, but I must ask you something. You say the blackmailer does not merely want money, or he wants influence. He wants favours. Are you certain?" And here Holmes's voice took on a peculiar softness, dangerous as velvet over steel. "Are you certain that you are not being used as a messenger, not merely of a packet, but of your own disgrace?" Mr. Harrowby stared, uncomprehending. "I do not understand." Holmes rose suddenly and went again to the window. He parted the curtain and peered out into the fog. "Watson," said he quietly, without turning, "do you see anything in the street?" I stepped to his side. The lamplight made a pale island upon the pavement, but beyond it the fog was a thick wall. For a moment I saw nothing. Then, at the very edge of visibility, there seemed to be a darker smear, something that shifted slightly as if a man had drawn back into shadow. "I cannot be sure," I whispered. "Yeah, perhaps someone standing by the railings." Holmes dropped the curtain. "You were followed," he said to Mr. Harrowby. The man sprang up, his hand flying to his throat. "No, impossible. I took a cab. I changed twice." Holmes's eyes were like ice. "You changed as an honest man changes openly," said he. "Not as a hunted man changes, by doubling back, by watching reflections, by testing the tale. Sit down. If you bolt into the fog, you will be cut off before you reach the corner." Mr. Harrowby sank back, trembling. "What do you mean?" he gasped. Are they here?" Holmes crossed to the bell rope and gave it a sharp pull. "Mrs. Hudson!" he called. In an instant the landlady appeared, pale but resolute. "Mrs. Hudson," said Holmes, "be so good as to bolt the street door and then bring up the poker from the kitchen." Her eyes widened. But she did not question him. "Yes, Mr. Holmes," she said, and vanished again. Holmes turned to us. "Watson," said he, "you will stand by that door. Mr. Harrowby, you will sit there where you are and do precisely what I tell you. This case—" and now his voice, for the first time, held a note of genuine excitement, "promises to be more entertaining than I had dared to hope. I confess that, though I have faced danger at my friend's side in many forms, there was something peculiarly sinister in that quiet room, with the fog pressing against the panes and an unseen watcher lurking below. This was not the straightforward peril of a knife or pistol. It was the stealthy menace of a mind at work in darkness, of a hand that could reach into the very heart of London society and squeeze. There came, at that moment, another sound, a soft thud from the street door below, as if something had been pushed against it. Then, faintly, a scraping, like metal upon wood. Holmes's eyes shone. He moved, noiseless as a cat, to the sitting-room door and listened, his head bent. "Yes," he whispered, more to himself than to us. "Quite so." And then, with a swift motion, he blew out the lamp. The room plunged into darkness, save for the ruddy glow of the fire. In that uncertain light I saw Holmes's face turn toward me, calm, intent, almost smiling. "Now, Watson," he murmured, "we shall meet, if only for a moment, the blackmailer of London's elite." End of section 1. The sudden darkness seemed to press the air closer about us, and for an instant even the crackle of the fire sounded unnaturally loud. I heard Mr. Harrowby draw in his breath sharply, as though he feared that the very act of breathing might betray him. Holmes, by contrast, appeared perfectly at ease. He moved with the assurance of one who knows exactly where every object lies, even when sight is denied him. From below there came the faint but unmistakable sound of metal worrying at a lock, slow, cautious, skillful. Whoever was at work there did not wish to announce himself by haste. Holmes leaned close to my ear. "Listen carefully, Watson," he murmured. "That is not the hand of a common burglar. Hear the pauses. He is testing, adjusting. He knows the resistance he expects to meet." The scraping ceased for a moment, and in the silence that followed I became acutely aware of my own pulse. Then came a dull click, followed by a muffled oath, spoken so softly that it was little more than a vibration through the floorboards. Our Mr. Harrowby half rose from his chair. "They are coming up," he whispered. "Sit still," Holmes replied, his voice barely audible but firm as iron. "They expect a frightened man. They do not expect me." There was a sound at the foot of the stairs now, cloth brushing wood, a measured step, placed with care. Mrs. Hudson's bolt held, but it was already clear to Holmes that the street door was not their true objective. The house itself was being tested, mapped, understood. A shadow slid beneath the crack of the sitting-room door. Holmes straightened, every line of him alert. He reached into his pocket and placed something cold and metallic into my palm, a spare revolver. "Should there be more than one," he whispered, "you will not hesitate." The handle was damp with his finger's warmth when I closed my own around it. The door handle turned, I slowly, testing. Then it stopped. Whoever stood outside had realized that the room was dark. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the door opened an inch, then two. A wedge of blacker darkness intruded, carrying with it the faint odor of damp wool and cheap tobacco. A man's silhouette filled the gap. In that instant, Holmes struck a match. The flare lit the room with a sudden, merciless brilliance, and in its glow I saw the intruder plainly. He was of middle height, broad across the shoulders, with a cap pulled low and a scarf drawn up over his mouth. His eyes, however, were uncovered, and it was in them that his undoing lay. They widened, not in fear, but in surprise tinged with irritation, as though the presence of Sherlock Holmes were an inconvenience rather than a shock. Holmes brought the lamp alight with a single smooth motion. "Oh, you have come rather late for a social call," said he pleasantly. "And you have chosen the wrong house." The man made to retreat, but Holmes was already upon him. There was a brief, sharp struggle, the scrape of boots, a grunt of pain, and then the intruder was flung forward, stumbling into the room. Watson the soldier overcame Watson the spectator, and before the man could recover his balance, I had him covered. Mrs. Hudson appeared behind us, poker in hand, her face pale but resolute. "Well," she exclaimed, "I knew it." The intruder straightened slowly. Seeing the revolver levelled at his chest, he raised his hands with exaggerated calm. "This is unnecessary," he said. His voice was low, educated, and betrayed no trace of the rough criminal I had half expected. I am merely here to deliver a message." "Indeed," said Holmes. You will forgive me if I prefer messages delivered through the post. They are less likely to break into my sitting room." The man's eyes flicked to Mr. Harrowby, and for the briefest instant I saw something pass between them. Recognition, swift and unmistakable. Holmes saw it too. "So," said he softly, "you do know each other." The intruder hesitated, then gave a short, humourless laugh. "Only by reputation," he said, "which is more than sufficient." "Your reputation is an interesting one," Holmes replied. "You are careful, adaptable, and you choose your ground well. But you have made one error tonight." "And that is?" the man asked. "You assumed that fear would keep your quarry silent," Holmes said. "Fear, when it grows too great, drives men to desperate measures, such as coming to me." The intruder's gaze hardened. "Then you know what this is about," he said. "I know a great deal," Holmes answered. "Enough to say that your enterprise is already in jeopardy." There was a pause. The fire snapped, throwing sparks upward. Outside, the fog pressed its pale face against the glass, as if straining to witness the scene. The man lowered his hands slowly. "You are very confident," he said. "But you are wrong if you think I am alone." Holmes smiled. "On the contrary," said he, "I should be disappointed if you were." He stepped closer, peering into the man's eyes with an intensity that made even me uneasy. "You are not the author of the letters," Holmes continued. "You are the courier, the intermediary. The mind behind this scheme is elsewhere. You break in, you follow, you apply pressure, but you do not design." The man's jaw tightened. You cannot prove that." "Not yet," Holmes agreed. "But I shall. And when I do, your employer will be the one who truly fears the knock at the door." Mr. Harrowby found his voice at last. "Who is he?" he demanded hoarsely. "For God's sake, who's doing this to us?" The intruder glanced at him, and there was something almost like pity in his eyes. "You already know," he said quietly. "You just don't dare to admit it." Before Holmes could reply, there came a sudden sharp whistle from the street below, short, urgent, unmistakably a signal. The man's head snapped round. "They are waiting for me," he said. "Yes," Holmes replied calmly, "and so am I." In that moment I understood that this encounter, dramatic as it was, marked only the outermost edge of the mystery. The hand we had seized was not the one that pulled the strings. Somewhere beyond the fog and gaslight, beyond even the reach of Scotland Yard, there existed a mind subtle enough to bend the powerful and invisible enough to remain untouched. And Sherlock Holmes, standing there with his thin smile and unwavering eyes, had just accepted the challenge. Holmes did not move at the whistle, nor did he so much as glance toward the window. His attention remained fixed upon the man before us, as though the signal from below were no more than the cry of a distant bird. "Excellent," he said quietly. "That simplifies matters." The intruder's composure faltered for the first time. He shifted his weight, calculating distances, door, window, stair, but every avenue was closed. I stood firm with the revolver. Mrs. Hudson blocked the rear like a grim sentinel. And Holmes himself occupied that indefinable centre of gravity which made resistance feel futile before it was even attempted. "You won't keep me," the man said. "You know that. I've broken no law that can be proved." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "you have committed a rather charming assortment of offences this evening, breaking and entering foremost among them, but I have no intention of handing you over to the police." That statement startled both the intruder and Mr. Harrowby. "No?" said the former cautiously. "No," Holmes repeated. You are far more valuable to me at liberty under certain conditions." The man studied Holmes intently now, and I could see that he was reassessing him, not as a mere obstacle, but as a potential threat of an entirely different order. "You want me to lead you to him," he said. Holmes inclined his head. "Odd, eventually, but not tonight. Tonight I want you to return and report exactly what you have seen." "And what should that be?" "That Mr. Harrowby came to Baker Street in a state of terror," Holmes said evenly. "That he found me uninterested, unhelpful, perhaps even skeptical. That you gained entry, frightened him further, and departed without interference." The intruder gave a short laugh. "You think he'll believe that?" "I think," Holmes replied, "that he already believes himself infallible. Such men always do." There was a pause, heavy with calculation. "And if I refuse?" the man asked. Holmes's expression hardened just perceptibly. "Then I shall detain you," he said, "not as a criminal, but as a subject of study. I assure you that would be far more uncomfortable." The intruder held his gaze for a long moment. Then, with a slow nod, he reached up and removed his cap and scarf, revealing a sharp-featured face marked by intelligence rather than brutality. "You're a dangerous man, Mr. Holmes," he said. "Dangerous in a way my employer did not account for." "Few ever do," Holmes replied. The man turned toward the door. "One thing more," Holmes added. "When you see him, when you deliver your report, you will mention that I examined the letter and the photograph. You will say that I was interested in the key." The intruder's eyes flickered. "I don't know what it opens," he said carefully. "No," Holmes agreed. "But he does." Without another word, the man slipped out into the darkness, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. A moment later we heard the soft retreat of footsteps on the stair, then the street door opening and shutting below. But only when all sound had faded did Holmes relax his posture. He turned to Mrs. Hudson with a courteous inclination of the head. "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson. You have saved us a great deal of trouble." She sniffed, gripping the poker a little tighter. "I've lived in this house long enough to know when trouble's about," she said, "and I don't trust gentlemen who come sniffing after dark." With that, she withdrew, bolting the door behind her. Mr. Harrowby sagged back into his chair as though the strength had gone out of his limbs. "You let him go," he said faintly. "Yes," Holmes replied, "because keeping him would have been the slower path. But he's part of it. He admitted as much." "Part," Holmes echoed, "not the whole. The man you fear does not risk himself on staircases and in fog."
"He delegates." Holmes picked up the small brass key once more, turning it thoughtfully between his fingers. "Watson," he said, "do you recall Lord Fenwick's suicide?" "Of course. A quiet man, devout, impeccable reputation," Holmes continued, "and yet driven to shoot himself rather than face exposure. That tells us something very important." "That his secret was grave?" "That his secret was specific," Holmes corrected. "A man may weather vague scandal. What destroys is precision, dates, places, objects, keys." He held the key up to the light again. "This is not merely symbolic. It opens something tangible, something that holds proof. And that proof is being distributed in fragments, like poison in measured doses." Mr. Harrowby leaned forward.
"Or do you think there is a place, a single place, where all of this is kept?" "I am certain of it," Holmes replied, "and I believe Lord Fenwick had access to it." A silence fell between us as the implication settled. "He killed himself," I said slowly, "because he knew what was there." "Or because he believed," Holmes said, "that by removing himself he might protect others. A mistaken assumption, as it turns out." Mr. Harrowby buried his face in his hands. "What am I to do?" he asked. "For the moment," Holmes said. "Exactly what you have already done." "Nothing." He rose and began pacing the room, his mind clearly racing ahead. "Tomorrow," he went on, "you will receive another communication, either directly or through our friend who just left. You will agree to comply. You will appear cowed. Meanwhile, how Watson and I shall concern ourselves with Lord Fenwick's final days." "You mean to investigate his death?" "I mean," Holmes replied, stopping abruptly, "to investigate what he feared more than death." He turned to me, his eyes alight with that familiar, exhilarating intensity. "Watson, clear your schedule," he said. "By this time tomorrow, I intend to know what lies behind that key, and whether the blackmailer of London's elite is quite as untouchable as he believes." As I looked at him there, framed by firelight and fog, I felt again that mingled dread and anticipation which always accompanied the opening moves of one of Holmes's greater battles. We were no longer dealing merely with crime, but with power wielded in secret, and the stakes, I knew, would rise swiftly from this point onward. But Holmes extinguished the fire and drew the curtains closer, as though sealing the room from the world beyond. The fog outside pressed thicker now, muting even the distant clatter of late carriages. Mr. Harrowby took his leave shortly afterward, departing by Holmes's express instructions in a cab summoned from the neighbouring street, with orders to drive twice around Regent's Park before setting him down. Holmes watched his departure from the window with the keen satisfaction of a chess player who has advanced a pawn exactly where it must stand. When the sound of wheels had faded, Holmes turned back into the room, already transformed from host to investigator. "We have a narrow window, Watson," he said. "Our adversary believes himself invisible, but invisibility depends upon routine. Fenwick's death disrupted that routine, and fear has accelerated the tempo that always produces errors." He gathered the letter, the photograph fragment, and the key, laying them out with meticulous care. "Lord Fenwick died a week ago," he continued. "Publicly it was grief, fatigue, perhaps melancholy. Privately it was panic. The question is, panic induced by what discovery?" "His secret," I ventured. "Not merely his secret," Holmes corrected. "Secrets do not kill men unless they are about to be used. Fenwick feared something imminent." He took up his violin, drew a single thoughtful note from it, then set it aside again. "Tomorrow morning," he went on, "we begin at Brackenhurst House." I started. "You think his family will receive us?" "They will receive you," Holmes replied calmly. "A doctor calling upon a bereaved widow is never refused. I shall arrive later, or in a less conspicuous capacity." The following morning broke grey and chill. London seemed hushed, as if the fog of the night had settled into the bricks themselves. I arrived at Brackenhurst House shortly after 10, announced as Dr. Watson, late friend and occasional medical adviser to the late Lord Fenwick. Lady Fenwick, pale and hollow-eyed, received me in a drawing-room heavy with mourning drapes and unspoken grief. She spoke little, answering my gentle inquiries with a kind of exhausted politeness. Lord Fenwick, she said, had been anxious in his last days, preoccupied, withdrawn. He had spent long hours alone in his study and had forbidden even his valet to enter. On the night of his death, he had dismissed the household early. "It was as though we were waiting for something," she said quietly. "Or dreading it?" I asked, and with what delicacy I could muster, whether any letters or unusual visitors had troubled him. She hesitated, then nodded. "There were letters," she said, "always addressed in the same hand. He burned them as soon as he read them." "Did he ever mention their contents?" "Never, but once." She faltered, then went on. "Once he asked me whether I believed a man could ever truly escape his past." I took my leave shortly thereafter, my mind heavy with implications. Holmes arrived that afternoon, not as himself, but as a representative of a firm engaged in cataloguing private libraries for estate purposes. By evening, he had seen Fenwick's study. When we met again at Baker Street, his eyes shone with restrained triumph. The study was locked, he said, and the lock had been altered recently. New tumblers, a crude but effective precaution. And the key? I asked. He placed the small brass key upon the table. It fits, he said, simply. The lock had guarded not papers, but a narrow cupboard concealed behind a false panel. Within it, Holmes had found a metal dispatch box, empty now save for scratches where documents had once been hastily removed. But not hastily enough, Holmes added. The interior lining bears impressions, envelopes of uniform size, photographs, and, his finger tapped the table, a notebook. You found it? No, but I know it exists. Holmes paced, his thoughts clearly ranging ahead. The blackmailer does not rely on memory, he relies on records. Fenwick knew that box existed, knew what it contained, and knew it was no longer secure. When the key was sent to Mr. Harrowby, it was a warning, I have access to what you fear most. Then the box is no longer at Brackenhurst, I said. Precisely, Holmes replied. Which means it has been moved somewhere convenient, accessible, and neutral. Charing Cross, I suggested, recalling the letter. Holmes smiled thinly. A porter's box is a place where things pass unnoticed, he said. But it is not where one keeps treasures. No, the delivery point is merely a test, a measure of obedience. He stopped abruptly and turned to me. Watson, tell me, who benefits from influence without appearing to seek it? Politicians, I said slowly. Industrialists, men who operate behind committees. Or philanthropists, Holmes added, men whose virtue disarms suspicion. He reached for the morning paper and spread it upon the table, all pointing to a modest column announcing a charitable foundation's expansion. The Belgravia Moral Reform Trust, he said, founded by Sir Lionel Brooke, a tireless advocate for public virtue, and, his eyes glittered, a man who served alongside Fenwick on no fewer than 3 discrete committees. The name lingered in the air between us, heavy with possibility. The blackmailer, I said, is a moralist. The most dangerous kind, Holmes replied softly. One who sins, records the sins of others, and then punishes them in private. Outside, the fog began once more to creep along the street. Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. Tomorrow, he said, we shall see whether Sir Lionel Brooke keeps his records as neatly as his reputation. And I knew then that the net was tightening, strand by careful strand, and around a man who believed himself beyond reach. Holmes rose early the next morning, already dressed and alert, as though he had never slept at all. The fog had thinned somewhat, leaving the streets washed and grey, and from our window I could see the steady movement of clerks and tradesmen beginning their day, with no notion of the quiet war being waged above their heads. Sir Lionel Brooke is punctual, Holmes remarked, consulting his watch. A man who preaches discipline rarely forgives himself lateness. At 9 precisely, he will arrive at his offices in Belgravia, and at 9:30 he will receive a delegation from the Temperance League. We shall see him in between. And how do you propose to gain an audience? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. By appealing to his vanity, he said, and by reminding him indirectly that reputations are fragile things. We approached Brooke's townhouse from the mews. Holmes, now transformed into a slightly stooped man with greying whiskers and the careful gait of one accustomed to committees rather than streets. I followed as his assistant, carrying a leather portfolio heavy with blank paper and implication. The brass plate by the door gleamed with recent polishing, and the bell was answered promptly by a discreet manservant. Sir Lionel Brooke received us in a room that proclaimed virtue with every furnishing. The walls were lined with worthy texts. Portraits of earnest-faced reformers looked down from above. The very air smelled of polish and restraint. Brooke himself was a tall man with silvered hair and an expression of mild, perpetual concern, and as though the moral state of the world weighed upon him constantly. Holmes introduced himself as Mr. Ainsworth, representing an interested benefactor of the Belgravia Moral Reform Trust. "We are conducting inquiries," Holmes said smoothly, "into certain administrative practices, purely precautionary, you understand. With organizations of influence, transparency is paramount." Sir Lionel's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course," he said, "I welcome scrutiny. It is the only safeguard of virtue." Holmes nodded appreciatively. "Indeed, that is why we wish to speak with you privately regarding a former associate, Lord Fenwick." At the name, Sir Lionel's fingers paused upon the arm of his chair. "A tragic business," he said. "A great shock to us all." "So I imagine," Holmes replied. "Yet shock does not preclude curiosity. Why, Lord Fenwick served alongside you on several committees concerned with personal conduct." Sir Lionel inclined his head. "He was deeply committed to reform." "And deeply troubled," Holmes added gently, "troubled enough to take his own life." A shadow crossed Sir Lionel's face, quickly masked. "There are burdens," he said, "which even the strongest men cannot bear." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Burdens imposed by others," he suggested. Sir Lionel stiffened. "I fail to understand you." Holmes opened the portfolio and withdrew, not the photograph fragment itself, but a carefully prepared tracing of it. "Do you recognize this ring?" he asked. For a fraction of a second, so brief that another man might have missed it, Sir Lionel's eyes flickered downward, then back up again. "No," he said. Holmes smiled, closing the portfolio. "Very well," he said. "Then perhaps you will recognize the key." He produced the brass key and placed it gently upon the table between them. Sir Lionel did not touch it, his gaze fixed upon the object as though it were alive. "I have no idea what that is," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "On the contrary," Holmes replied quietly, "you know exactly what it opens." There was a long silence. Outside, a carriage passed, its wheels loud in the pause. Sir Lionel leaned back at last. "You are playing a dangerous game," he said. Holmes met his gaze steadily. "So are you." The reformer's composure began to fray. "You think," he said slowly, "that you have uncovered something original. You have not. These men, Fenwick, Harrowby, the others, they were corrupt. Hypocrites."
I merely ensured that their influence was redirected. "By fear," I said, unable to keep silent. "By accountability," Sir Lionel snapped. Then catching himself, he softened his tone. "Someone had to act." Holmes rose. "Indeed," he said. "And now someone else has." Sir Lionel laughed softly. "You have no proof," he said. "No witnesses, no box, no records." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Not yet," he agreed. "But you made one mistake." "And that is?" "You trusted intermediaries," Holmes said. "And intermediaries talk, especially when they believe they are being watched." Sir Lionel's face drained of colour. Holmes turned toward the door. "Enjoy your meeting," he said. "The Temperance League awaits." We left him there, seated amid his books and portraits, suddenly very alone. Back in the street, Holmes breathed deeply.
As though savouring the chill air. "He will not flee," he said. "Men like Brooke believe too strongly in their own righteousness, but he will act, and in acting he will reveal where the records are kept. And the courier? I asked. Holmes's smile returned, sharp and confident. He will come to us, he said. Fear works both ways. As we walked on, I felt the case tightening once more, not toward a sudden climax, but toward something far more satisfying. The slow, inevitable exposure of a man who had mistaken secrecy for invulnerability. Holmes was as good as his word. We had not been back at Baker Street an hour before Mrs. Hudson announced, with visible satisfaction, that a gentleman insisted upon seeing Mr. Holmes at once and had no intention of leaving without doing so. The description she gave, a man of sharp features, restless eyes, and an air of suppressed urgency, left little doubt as to his identity. "Show him in," Holmes said, settling himself with an air of almost careless ease. "And Mrs. Hudson, leave the door unbolted." The courier entered briskly, shutting the door behind him and then thinking better of it, reopening it a few inches, as though the open space were a reassurance. He did not bother with pleasantries. "You spoke to Brooke," he said. Holmes inclined his head. "This morning." The man exhaled sharply. "He knows, then?" "He suspects," Holmes replied, "which is far more dangerous." The courier crossed the room, running a hand through his hair. "You've put me in an impossible position," he said. "He's already changed arrangements, meetings cancelled, papers moved. He's frightened." "As he should be," Holmes said mildly.
You don't understand," the man snapped. "If he falls, he will not fall alone." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Then we are agreed that he must be stopped." The courier hesitated. His bravado, which had carried him through staircases and shadows, had drained away now that he stood in full light. "The records," he said at last. "They aren't in Belgravia. They haven't been for months." Holmes leaned forward. "Where then?" "In a place no one would question," the man replied. "A place associated with charity, with reform, a refuge." Holmes smiled faintly. "A shelter," he murmured. "Or an institution." The courier nodded. "St. Agnes House," he said, "for fallen women." I felt a chill at the name. The irony was almost unbearable. Holmes, however, showed no surprise. "Of course," he said. "A locked room within a locked conscience." "It's kept in a sub-office," the man went on. "Second floor, iron cabinet. Only Brooke and I have keys, or had." Holmes's eyes flicked briefly to the brass key on the table. "You removed the box after Fenwick's death?" he said. "Yes," the courier admitted. "Brooke panicked. He feared the police, feared inquiries. He ordered me to relocate everything." "And yet you remained," Holmes said softly. "Why?" The man laughed bitterly. "Because he owns me," he said, or thought he did. Holmes stood. "Then we shall relieve him of that illusion tonight." It was arranged with the precision of a military operation. Holmes would enter St. Agnes House as a representative of a benefactor. Anonymity was the lifeblood of such places. I was to follow later, ostensibly to conduct a medical inspection.
The courier would ensure that Sir Lionel Brooke arrived after nightfall, under the impression that his records had been compromised. St. Agnes House stood grim and forbidding against the darkening sky, its brickwork austere, its windows few and narrow. Inside, the air smelled of soap and boiled cabbage, of discipline imposed in the name of salvation. Holmes moved through its corridors with quiet assurance, his disguise impeccable, his manner gently authoritative. The sub-office lay exactly where the courier had said. The iron cabinet stood against the far wall, solid, unremarkable, and ominous in its silence. Holmes tested the key. It turned smoothly. Within lay the heart of the evil, carefully catalogued folders, envelopes cross-referenced with dates and initials, photographs reduced to fragments, letters pressed flat and annotated in a neat, precise hand. It was not chaos but order, a system designed to extract obedience with the least possible effort. Holmes closed the cabinet softly. "Watson," he said, "this is not merely blackmail, it is governance." Before I could reply, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, measured, confident, unmistakably belonging to a man who believed he still commanded events. Sir Lionel Brooke entered the room and stopped dead at the sight of us. "You," he said. "Yes," Holmes replied. "And it is over." Brooke recovered himself quickly. "You cannot touch me," he said. "These records are evidence," Holmes interrupted, "of conspiracy, coercion, and, in Fenwick's case, manslaughter." Brooke laughed, but the sound rang hollow. "You think I will be sacrificed?" he said.
Men far above me depend on this." Holmes stepped aside, revealing the courier in the doorway. "Your dependence has just resigned," Holmes said. Brooke stared at the man, comprehension dawning at last. "You traitor." The courier's voice was steady. "I prefer survivor." There was nothing theatrical in Brooke's collapse. No confession, no plea. Only a slow sinking into a chair, as though the moral weight he had imposed upon others had finally settled upon himself. Later, as we walked back through the quiet streets, Holmes spoke at last. "Power," he said, "is safest in the open. When it hides, it rots." "And the others?" I asked. "They will be exposed as necessary," he replied. "Enough to end the practice, not enough to destroy indiscriminately." I looked at him with admiration. "You chose restraint," I said. He smiled thinly.
"I chose justice," he replied. "There is a difference." And as the fog lifted slightly over London, I felt that one of its darkest shadows had at last been drawn into the light. The consequences did not unfold with the dramatic immediacy one might expect, and Holmes had long taught me that true resolutions seldom do. The net, once drawn tight, must be secured carefully, lest its quarry slip through by some legal artifice or political intervention. Sir Lionel Brooke was not arrested that night. Such a move would have been clumsy and premature. Instead, Holmes set in motion a quieter machinery, one that ground slowly but with irresistible force. By morning, discreet copies of selected documents had been placed where they could not be ignored. As not newspapers, Holmes had no wish to unleash indiscriminate scandal, but into the hands of two men whose probity was matched only by their influence. One sat on the Home Office Advisory Board, the other owed his career to a reputation for incorruptibility so rigid that even rumour recoiled from it. Holmes chose them with care, as a surgeon chooses his instruments. "Pressure," he observed over breakfast, "is most effective when applied at the joints." Sir Lionel Brooke, summoned to a private inquiry under the guise of administrative review, found himself confronted not by accusations but by questions, precise, informed, and impossible to evade. The iron cabinet at St. Agnes House was sealed by order before noon. By evening, Brooke had tendered his resignation from every committee and trust with which he was associated, citing ill health and fatigue. The phrase amused Holmes greatly. "Fatigue," he remarked, "a most accurate diagnosis." The courier, whose name I learned only as Hale, vanished from London within 48 hours, furnished with just enough protection to ensure his silence and just enough freedom to secure his loyalty. Holmes had no illusions about reforming him. He was a tool, Holmes said, sharp, but not self-directing. Men like that are safest when removed from the hand that wielded them. As for Mr. Harrowby, he came to Baker Street one final time, looking 10 years younger than when I had first seen him. "It has stopped," he said simply. The letters, the demands, all of it. Holmes nodded. The machine has been dismantled, he replied. It may be rebuilt elsewhere by other hands, but not in that form. And Lord Fenwick? Harrowby asked quietly. Holmes's expression softened. The truth of his death will remain private, he said. Those who need to understand it do. Those who would merely consume it do not. Harrowby stood, clearly moved. You have saved more than reputations, he said. You have saved lives. Holmes waved the sentiment away with characteristic impatience. I have merely removed a parasite, he said. The body politic will survive on its own. After Harrowby had gone, Holmes stood for a long while at the window, watching the city resume its ceaseless motion. The fog was lifting now, revealing streets scrubbed clean by recent rain, the pavements alive with ordinary men and women wholly unaware of how close some of their betters had come to ruin. Or you could have destroyed him utterly, I said at last. Brooke, I mean. Holmes turned. Yes, he said. And in doing so I should have become what he was, a man who believes himself justified by his own moral arithmetic. He paused, then added more quietly, Power exposes character, Watson. It does not excuse it. In the days that followed, minor resignations appeared in the society pages, unconnected on the surface, yet forming a pattern to those who knew where to look. Committees were quietly restructured. Certain initiatives lost momentum and were replaced by others, less ostentatious and more humane. It was not justice in the theatrical sense, but it was correction. And in Holmes's view, that was enough. One evening, as Holmes played a subdued air upon his violin, I asked him whether he thought another such figure would arise to take Brooke's place. Undoubtedly, he replied without pausing. London produces them as reliably as it produces fog. And you? I asked. Will you always be there to stop them? Holmes's bow slowed. No, he said, but I need not be. Men like Brooke depend upon secrecy and the assumption that no one is watching. Remove that assumption and they falter. He set the violin aside and smiled faintly. Besides, he added, they are rarely as clever as they think. I wrote up the case with care, disguising names and circumstances, for Holmes insisted that some lessons were best learned obliquely. Yet even now, as I set down these recollections, I am struck by the peculiar nature of the adversary we faced, not a thief or murderer in the common sense, but something colder and more insidious, a man who weaponized virtue itself. It was, Holmes later remarked, one of the more distasteful cases we had undertaken. Crime, he said, is often born of need or passion. This was born of certainty. And certainty, I have learned, is the most dangerous motive of all. Yet even as the immediate ripples of the affair subsided, Holmes did not permit himself the luxury of finality. I had observed before that he distrusted neat endings. To his mind, a problem too cleanly resolved was often merely resting, not finished. For several days after Brooke's withdrawal from public life, Holmes remained uncharacteristically vigilant, scanning newspapers, revisiting correspondence, and spending long hours in silent thought broken only by the occasional sharp note of his violin. "How you expect to counterstroke?" I said one evening, as he folded a letter and slipped it into the fire. "I expect inertia to resist change," he replied. "Systems do not collapse willingly. They creak, they settle, they disguise themselves as something new." It was on the fourth evening that the proof of his caution arrived. A note was delivered by hand, no postmark, no seal, left with Mrs. Hudson, by a boy who vanished before questions could be asked. The paper was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar, but the content was enough to bring Holmes abruptly to his feet. He handed it to me without a word. "You have cut away a branch and mistaken it for the root. If you wish to understand the whole, Come alone to the embankment tomorrow at dusk. Ask for the steps below Cleaver's Wharf. Bring no police, bring your curiosity. There was no signature. And I looked up. You don't believe this is Brooke? Holmes finished. No, he lacks both imagination and courage at this stage. This is someone else, someone who watched and learned. Then the affair isn't over. Holmes's eyes gleamed with something between irritation and relish. On the contrary, he said, now it becomes interesting. The following evening found us walking along the Thames as the last of the daylight bled into the water, turning it the colour of tarnished brass. Holmes had insisted I accompany him despite the note's wording. Alone, he said dryly, is a relative term. I merely shall not announce you. Cleaver's Wharf lay in a quieter stretch of the river, its steps slick with damp and neglect. The air smelled of mud and cold iron. A single figure stood at the foot of the steps, silhouetted against the slow-moving water. He did not turn as we approached. You dismantled Brooke efficiently, the man said, too efficiently for a single conscience. Holmes stopped a few paces away. You sent the note, Holmes replied. Then you are either reckless or convinced of your safety. The man turned. He was younger than I expected, well-dressed, with the composed bearing of one accustomed to observing rather than acting. I am an accountant, he said, calmly. I audited several of Brooke's charitable interests. I saw the patterns before you did. Holmes studied him intently. And you did nothing, Holmes said. I did something better, the man replied. I waited. To inherit, Holmes suggested. The man smiled faintly. Correct. Holmes's voice hardened. You mistake yourself. You are no reformer.
Here, you are merely tempted by an abandoned weapon. Isn't that what you did? The man asked quietly. You chose what to expose, what to suppress. You shaped the outcome. Holmes stepped closer. I removed coercion, he said. You would refine it. The man's smile vanished. You think men will behave without fear, he said. They won't. They never have. Holmes regarded him for a long moment, then shook his head. You are wrong in one important respect, he said. Fear is a blunt instrument. It attracts attention. What you propose would fail for the same reason Brooke failed. And why is that? Because, Holmes said, you came here tonight. The man stiffened. You wanted to test me, Holmes went on. To see whether I would ignore you, bargain with you, or threaten you. Instead, you revealed yourself.
Curiosity overcame caution. The man glanced past Holmes toward where I stood half hidden in shadow, and understanding dawned in his eyes. You were never meant to succeed, Holmes concluded. You were meant to be observed. The man laughed softly, but there was unease in it now. You won't expose me, he said. You don't even know my name. No, Holmes agreed. But I know your function, and that is enough. He turned away. Go back to your ledgers, Holmes said over his shoulder. If I ever see your hand moving toward the same machinery again, I shall not be so discreet. We walked back along the embankment in silence. At last, I spoke. You let him go? Yes, Holmes said, because he has learned the cost of visibility. And if he hasn't, Holmes's thin smile returned. Then he will learn it more thoroughly. Back at Baker Street, Holmes resumed his violin, playing a slow, reflective melody that seemed to echo the river's dark flow. The case, I realized, had not ended with arrests or trials, but with something subtler, a recalibration of balance. London slept that night unaware, its elite uneasy, its shadows thinner than before. And Holmes, content at last, allowed himself the rare indulgence of rest, satisfied that, for the moment, the blackmailer's art had been rendered too dangerous to practice. Holmes slept late the following morning, a circumstance so rare that I noted it with some concern. When he did emerge from his room, it was with the air of a man who has reached a provisional equilibrium rather than a final peace. He accepted his tea absently, glanced through the post with cursory interest, and then paused, at holding one envelope between finger and thumb as though it possessed a weight beyond its paper. "This," he said at last, "is the sound of a system settling." The letter bore no crest, no flourish. It was addressed simply to S. Holmes, Esquire, and postmarked from Westminster. Holmes opened it and read in silence, then passed it to me. It was brief. Merely a notice that a parliamentary subcommittee had opened an internal review into certain charitable foundations associated with public reform, citing irregularities of governance and undue influence. No names were mentioned. None were needed. "They move carefully," I observed. "They always do," Holmes replied. "The object is not spectacle, but containment." He turned to the window, watching a delivery cart rattle past below. "Well, the man at the embankment was not wrong in one respect," he continued. "There are always others waiting to step into a vacuum. What matters is not that they exist, but that they hesitate." "And you think he will?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "I think he already has." That afternoon brought confirmation. A mutual acquaintance, a barrister with a talent for hearing things not meant for his ears, called upon Holmes under the pretext of a social visit. He spoke obliquely, as such men do, of cancelled consultations, of ledgers quietly surrendered, of one particularly promising civil servant who had requested reassignment to the provinces for personal reasons. "Fear," Holmes remarked after he had gone, "has a clarifying effect. It reveals who was acting from conviction and who from opportunity." In the days that followed, and the city adjusted itself almost imperceptibly. A few influential dinners were postponed. A handful of reputations lost their former lustre, though none collapsed outright. Holmes read these signs as a physician reads a pulse, measured, thoughtful, alert for relapse. One evening, as we sat in our accustomed chairs, I ventured to ask the question that had troubled me since the encounter by the river. "You threatened the accountant," I said, "but you did not expose him. Why?" Holmes regarded me thoughtfully. "Because," he said, "exposure is a finite weapon. Use it too freely and it dulls. Worse, it teaches others how to hide better." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "There are crimes best answered by law," he went on, "and there are crimes best answered by awareness. This was the latter, and I wished him to know that the shadows are no longer unoccupied." "And Brooke?" I asked. "Do you think he understands?" Holmes's expression grew distant. "Brooke understands loss," he said. "He does not yet understand why it came so easily. That ignorance will trouble him far more than any punishment." As if summoned by the mention of his name, a final letter arrived 2 mornings later. This one unmistakably from Sir Lionel Brooke. It was a model of restraint and wounded dignity, a request, not a plea, for the return of certain personal papers not germane to any ongoing inquiry. Holmes read it once and placed it unopened into the drawer where he kept relics of past cases. "He will not trouble us again," he said. "And the papers?" I asked. "They will remain where they are most useful," Holmes replied, "in obscurity." That night, Holmes took up his violin and played with unusual softness, the melody wandering, unresolved. It seemed to me then that the case had left its mark upon him in a way few others had, not as a challenge unmet, but as a reminder. "Watson," he said suddenly, lowering the bow, "do you know why I dislike cases of blackmail more than murder?" "Because they destroy without bloodshed," I suggested. "Because they invert morality," he replied. They place power in the hands of those who believe themselves righteous. A murderer knows he has crossed a line. A blackmailer believes he is enforcing one. He rose and crossed to the mantel, extinguishing the lamp one wick at a time. The danger, he added, is not that such men exist, but that society so often rewards them until it does not. In the weeks that followed, no new letters arrived, and no whispered demands surfaced in clubs or corridors. The machinery Holmes had dismantled remained inert, its operators cautious, its successors undecided. London, as ever, moved on, and Holmes, having restored, if only briefly, a measure of balance, returned his attention to smaller puzzles, a missing heirloom, a fraudulent medium, a curious case of mistaken identity. Yet I noticed that he listened more keenly when names were mentioned, watched more closely when influence passed hands. The blackmailer of London's elite had been unmasked not by a public reckoning, but by something far more unsettling to men of power, the certainty that they were no longer alone in the dark. It was, Holmes later remarked, with characteristic understatement, a satisfactory outcome for my own part, and I could not help but feel that we had glimpsed something rare in that affair, not merely the defeat of a villain, but the exposure of a temptation that lies forever at the heart of civilization, the urge to govern others by fear while calling it virtue. And that, I believe, was the true mystery Holmes had solved. Time, which dulls most impressions, appeared only to sharpen Holmes's awareness of what we had uncovered. Though new cases came and went, as they always did at Baker Street, there remained, for a while, an undercurrent of watchfulness in him, as though he listened for an echo that had not yet quite faded. I noticed it in small ways, a pause when a familiar name appeared in the paper, a faint tightening about the eyes when charitable committees were mentioned in conversation, a preference for silence where once he might have filled the room with speculation. It was during one such quiet evening, nearly a month after the affair had ostensibly concluded, that the final confirmation reached us. I had been reading by the fire when Holmes, standing at the mantel, suddenly let out a short, satisfied breath. "Checkmate," he murmured. I looked up. "What is it now?" I asked. He handed me the paper he had been studying. Buried deep within its columns was a brief notice of a civil proceeding, unremarkable at first glance, concerning the dissolution of a minor trust and the reassignment of its remaining funds under court supervision. The name of the trust meant nothing to me, but Holmes tapped it with a finger. "Founded with Brooke's assistance," he said. "Managed by a man who once audited the Moral Reform Trust. Quietly closed, its accounts surrendered in full." "The accountant?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "He has chosen safety," he said. "A wise decision, arrived at just in time." There was no triumph in his voice, only a calm certainty, as though a long equation had at last resolved itself. He returned the paper to the table and seated himself opposite me. "You see, Watson," he went on, "the object was never to punish every offender. That would be impossible and worse, ineffective. The object was to alter behavior." "And you believe you have?" I asked. "For now," he replied. "Fear alone does not reform, but uncertainty, awareness, that is another matter. Men who once acted with confidence will now hesitate. Hesitation creates space, and space allows decency a chance to reassert itself. I considered this. It is a fragile victory," I said. Holmes smiled faintly. "All victories are," he said. "The mistake is to believe otherwise." That night, Holmes spoke more freely of the case than he had done at any point since its inception. Perhaps the passage of time had softened the edges. Perhaps he felt the need, as he sometimes did, to set his thoughts in order through speech. Brooke was not exceptional, he said. That is what made him dangerous. He possessed no great intellect, no grand cruelty, only certainty that his view of the world entitled him to rule it from behind a curtain. And the others? I asked. Those who complied? They are easier to understand, Holmes replied. Most men will surrender a little freedom to protect a great deal of comfort. The tragedy lies not in their weakness, but in the system that exploited it. He fell silent for a moment, all gazing into the fire. Fenwick's death, he added quietly, was the true crime. Everything else followed from that. I knew better than to interrupt him when his thoughts took that turn. He believed that removing himself would break the chain, Holmes continued. In doing so, he revealed its existence, a grim irony, but not a useless one. The fire had burned low when Holmes rose and extinguished it, standing for a moment in the half-light. "Watson," he said, "do you know what distinguishes civilization from tyranny?" "Law?" I ventured. Holmes shook his head. "Visibility," he said. "Tyranny thrives in the unseen. Law merely gives form to what men are willing to look at together." The following morning brought a sense of closure I had not expected. Mr. Harrowby wrote to inform us that he intended to withdraw from public life for a time, citing the need for reflection. There was relief in his words, but also something like resolve. "I think," Holmes said after reading the letter, "that he may yet do some good, this time without coercion." And so, without ceremony, the case slipped into the past, as all cases do. London resumed its habits, chastened perhaps, but outwardly unchanged. The fog returned, as it always does. Committees met, reputations rose and fell, and the great city continued its endless balancing act between power and conscience. One evening, long afterward, as Holmes packed away his violin, I asked him whether he considered the affair a success. He considered the question seriously. "No," he said at last. "I consider it a correction." "And is that enough?" I asked. Holmes's eyes met mine, clear and steady. "It must be," he said.
A perfection is not attainable. Vigilance is." He smiled then, the familiar, elusive smile that so often marked the end of a matter. "Besides," he added lightly, "there are always more mysteries than solutions. That, Watson, is what keeps the world tolerable." With that, he reached for the morning's post, already turning his keen mind toward whatever puzzle might next present itself. The blackmailer of London's elite had vanished into obscurity, not through arrest or execution, but through exposure to the one force it could not withstand: scrutiny. And as I set down these final lines, I am convinced that the true triumph of that case lay not in the downfall of a single man, but in the reminder that even in the most rarefied circles of power there are still eyes willing to watch and minds capable of understanding what they see. There remained only one loose thread, and Holmes, as I have often observed, was never content to leave even the smallest fibre untied. It presented itself on a quiet Sunday afternoon, when the city seemed to pause in that peculiar half-silence which belongs neither to rest nor to industry. Holmes had been unusually idle all morning, reclining with closed eyes while his fingers drummed lightly upon the arm of his chair. I had learned by long experience that this apparent languor concealed a mind still at work, and I was not surprised when he suddenly spoke. "Watson," he said, without opening his eyes, "what do you suppose becomes of men like Brooke when the curtain falls?" "They retire, I imagine," I replied. "They live quietly on what remains of their reputation." "Precisely," Holmes said. "And that is why they so rarely understand their own defeat." He rose and went to the escritoire, unlocking a drawer from which he took a thin packet of papers, duplicates, as I recognized, of certain items we had removed from St. Agnes' house.
He selected one and handed it to me. It was a letter in Brooke's hand, never sent, its tone neither arrogant nor defiant, but bewildered. I believed I was necessary, it read, that without me the machinery would fail. Yet it continues, altered but intact. If I erred, it was in thinking myself indispensable. Holmes watched my face as I read. He wrote that 2 days after resigning, Holmes said. He sent it to no one, but he needed to write it. You allowed him to keep his illusion then, I said, that he was merely mistaken, not monstrous. Holmes shook his head. No, he replied. I allowed him to confront the most uncomfortable truth of all, that he was replaceable. He returned the papers to the drawer and locked it. That, he continued, is the final punishment for men who govern by fear. Fear magnifies them. Once it is removed, they diminish rapidly. As if to underscore his words, the bell rang below, and Mrs. Hudson announced a final visitor connected with the affair. It was the barrister who had earlier served as one of Holmes's quiet conduits of information. He came only to confirm what Holmes already knew. Sir Lionel Brooke had withdrawn entirely from public life and would, in all likelihood, spend the remainder of his days in obscurity, neither prosecuted nor forgiven, but politely forgotten. When the man had gone, Holmes settled once more into his chair. There will be no return, he said. Tish, not from him. And the others? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. They will remember, he said. Memory is the enemy of repetition. That evening, as dusk gathered and the lamps were lit along Baker Street, Holmes took up his violin for the last time in connection with the case. The melody he played was simple and restrained, without flourish or bravura, and I understood it then as a kind of private epitaph, not for Brooke, nor even for Fenwick, but for the particular danger we had confronted. When he finished, he set the instrument aside and spoke with a quiet finality. The matter is closed. I nodded, feeling that familiar mingling of satisfaction and unease which so often attended the conclusion of our more subtle investigations. In the records, I said. In the world, Holmes corrected. He turned toward the window, seeing where the city stretched away in gas-lit lines and shadowed courts. Blackmail, he said thoughtfully, is a crime of imbalance. It thrives where power accumulates unchecked and conscience is treated as an inconvenience. You cannot eliminate it entirely, Watson, any more than you can eliminate greed or vanity, but you can make it costly. And that is enough? I asked. Holmes's thin smile returned. It must be, he said. Civilization is not maintained by purity, but by friction. We spoke little after that. Holmes returned to his files, already absorbed in some minor problem which had caught his interest, while I sat reflecting upon the curious nature of the case we had just concluded. There had been no dramatic arrest, no courtroom revelation, no cheering crowds, yet the effect had been profound, if largely invisible. The men who had once acted with impunity now paused. Letters went unwritten. Demands were never made. Influence, once weaponized, had been rendered suspect. And that, I realized, was Holmes's true triumph. Some weeks later, when I suggested that I should write up the affair, Holmes considered the matter briefly. You may, he said, but disguise it thoroughly. Let it stand as a parable rather than a record. A warning? I asked. A reminder, he replied, that even in the highest circles there are limits, and that someone somewhere is always paying attention. Thus I set down the case of the Blackmailer of London's elite, not as a tale of villainy punished by the law, but as an account of something rarer and more delicate, the quiet reassertion of balance in a world forever tempted to abandon it. Holmes, for his part, never spoke of the affair again. Yet I noticed, long afterward, that whenever a letter arrived unsealed or a client spoke of influence wielded unseen, his eyes would sharpen and his attention focus with renewed intensity. For he knew, as I came to know, that the most dangerous crimes are those committed not in darkness alone, but under the banner of righteousness. And against such crimes Sherlock Holmes remained, as ever, London's most vigilant guardian,